We're in the audio business.
So, fortunately, we'll be speaking on tubes, totally tubular. And this really is a time of a great tube renaissance. And we're fortunate to have Charles Kirmuss here, importer of fine Darrad tube equipment, also Lawrence and Roger speakers, and Bravo headphones. And we have Kevin Deal, who just flew out just for this from California. Kevin Deal runs the most popular, easily the most best reviewed lines of PrimaLuna, and we have some examples of PrimaLuna products right here. And Kevin Deal also has been an expert on both tube equipment and various tube types. And Kevin Deal also has Upscale Audio, high-end audio company, too.
And I love tubes. My whole life is about tubes. Forget women, forget food, forget anything. It's just tubes.
So, what's all this fuss about tubes? Weren't they like turntables where it was supposed to die 30 or 50 years ago and it's obsolete, and why would anybody want them anymore? Well, tubes and turntables are technologies that are continually growing and becoming more and more popular just because they sound good. They're fun also, besides sounding good. Now, many audiophiles regard some of the best equipment ever made, and both most respected, and you could say best in terms of what brings the highest resale value, is generally classic tube units. Over here, this is a Marantz 7. Some people regard as one of the best tube preamps ever made. Marantz also had a 10B, which many people regard as the finest tuner ever made. And by the way, that was discontinued probably about 1970. So 44 or so years later, it's still regarded as the finest product. What's interesting is people in the recording business, their finest microphones usually could be a tube Neumann, it could be a tube Telefunken, but some AKG tube mics, but they're always tube mics. That's always what they're looked for. And also in the audio business, we have people whose favorite mixers, favorite preamps, all tube. Gee, there's a pattern coming here. And what's interesting too is that, say this was, $260 or so in, say, the mid-60s. There was a solid-state replacement priced about the same. And say with inflation, maybe that's $2,000. Somehow the solid-state replacement sells for very, very little. We've sold some in our store for, I don't know, $400 or $500. And this might sell for, 10 times that amount. And it doesn't matter whether it's Macintosh, Dynaco, say Fisher receiver, whatever the tube unit was, it was replaced by something generally more expensive in solid state. And say, a Mac 2100 is 100 watts per channel solid state. Maybe it's worth $500, $600, $700. But the 275 is worth $4,000 or $5,000, though originally it cost less when new. And the same thing will happen, like I say, with virtually any manufacturer. The solid state units, though they were more expensive, just people don't care about them. What's interesting too, it's not just a question of price, but at Gold Sound, that's a store I have about 10 minutes or so west of here, we have hundreds of pieces of used equipment. Now, it's interesting because we probably have a dozen or so Dynaco tube units. Say, and Dynaco had a Pass 2, Pass 3, both preamps, FM3 tuner. There's also there several monoblocks, Mark III, Mark IV, ST70, ST35, and one solid-state Dynaco. One. How did that happen? And there's a dozen or whatever tube, say Fisher and Scott, integrated amps and receivers. Number of their solid state replacements, about 0. What happened was that the tube technology by the 50s, 60s, or especially now, is pretty reliable and very easy to work on. And most things that went wrong was a matter of just changing a tube. The solid state units that followed were far, far less reliable. So much so that, for example, like the very early, say Harman Kardon had citation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were all tubes. And I've had maybe 20 or 30 or more come through the store over the years. I've never, ever seen their immediate solid-state replacements. Never. It's like they never existed. There was citation A, citation B. They were more expensive. Maybe there's some out in the world, we just don't see them. Okay? And the same, not to pick on Harman Kardon, but the same thing happened with Fisher, Scott. In fact, their solid-state equipment was unreliable enough that the whole popularity of the brands just went greatly, greatly down. But as nice as the old equipment is, the new equipment in many ways is much nicer, okay? In that I can open up and look at and hear very, very fine preamp, and several things. First, you could look at it, gee, there's not many switches here. There's lots and lots of switches here. The more switches you have, and things like filters, low filter, high filter, were desirable at one point. Most people don't want or need them, but the more controls you put on, there's more things to go wrong, but there's also, you put them on, it takes away from the sound. Okay? There's, the longer the signal path, just the worse things sound. Most people on modern speakers really don't need tone controls. And yet, bass, treble, and bass and treble for each channel, and loudness controls, etc., most people don't use today. The old ones have, the new ones don't. It's interesting because the first audio research products ever made were a hot-rodded Dynaco where they removed a lot of these switches, and automatically it sounded better. But beyond that, just the whole parts inside here. We have resistors that are carbon. Beyond not being good quality, carbon resistors just change their value over time. Just fact. Just like batteries change, capacitors change, resistors change. The capacitors inside, electrolytics, just are not very good compared to the mylar, polypropylene, polystyrene, much, much better capacitors in the newer units. For that matter, also better wiring. If we go, say, to a toroidal transformer, okay, or transformers today can be much, much quieter. The toroidal transformers effectively are self-shielded. And say this nice Darrett amplifier, Saturn, has that shielded sort of transformer. By the way, I've had manufacturers of expensive equipment mention about, they don't understand it, how an audiophile would pay 5 or 10 grand for their equipment and be upset that even without the speakers connected and no volume on, he could hear the amplifier buzzing from across the room. Well, the toroidal transformers, an equipment like that just doesn't do that, okay? But that's actually more of a problem with your very large solid-state amplifiers, in terms of having transformer noise, transformer buzzing. So, and reliability, we've had Dynacos come in, or Macintosh or others, that say they're from the 1960s. Step one, let's listen to it. Step two, oh gee, now let's remove the cover and look inside and see if are there any problems, do any parts look bad, etc. With, say, a Dynaco preamp, Dynaco tuners, Macintosh, some other brands, maybe half the time when they're sounding fine, the only tubes that have ever been in there are the originals. That is the tubes, I'll take out a tube and I'll say, oh, Dynaco, 1967. Gee, this is what it was born with. Or in one case I actually saw in Macintosh, 1956. That's the tube it came with from the factory. That is, there's date codes on the tubes. And of course, not all tubes last this long, but I'm just saying I've seen tubes last a long, long time. And with the right design, and Kevin can talk to you about this, they can last much, much longer. And these sort of amplifiers have tubes where we've had, actually, Kevin products in our store, the PrimaLuna, for a number of years. We've yet to replace a single tube. We've yet to have a customer come in needing a tube. And Kevin can talk more about that.
If you'd like. I'm almost like a tube evangelist, Put your hands on the vacuum tube and feel the warmth of my sincerity. I just want, because I don't know where to take this except I want to find, is there a question that maybe somebody had about tubes, or how many people have owned tubes before? Can I see a show of hands? And then, so most people have owned tubes before. How many own them now? Okay, so we're not talking to a new crowd of people. Was there any particular question that somebody maybe had about something that we want to make sure we get up on the table? Go ahead.
I have one. Considering all the technological advancements in tube gear that my colleague was just espousing, why is the old stuff still so popular?
Not all older stuff is real popular. Look. Okay, well, I'll tell you why. If you look back at history, at any product that was made in the 1960s that was vacuum tube, that was made like this Marantz was, with point-to-point wiring, without exception, they always go up in value. All of them, because point-to-point wiring products last forever. They're built to last forever, so they're easy to service. That's one reason. Plus, tubes are cool. I remember I was 18 when I started working at a parts store, my first job selling hi-fi. And we sold parts and resistors and transistors and tubes. And this crazy kook came in to buy tubes. And I go, dude, why are you buying those stupid tubes for this equipment? Why don't you get this new JVC with the equalizer built in, And he looked at me and he goes, you just don't know, do you? I remember that like it was yesterday. And he was absolutely right. But all of the older equipment, and especially products like Macintosh and Marantz, are very, very collectible, and they go up in price. That doesn't mean that that's what you should own, because not all of it really sounded that great. I've got a very big collection of incredible stuff because I love it, but it's not necessarily what I listen to. As far as new designs, there's not a lot of real new designs. This is an ultralinear design. That was invented in 1951 by David Hafler. So it's not a new design. There are new twists. There's new improvements that are made. They make better power. And they didn't make, well, maybe they did, but I don't believe they made toroidal power transformers back then.
No.
And output transformers are better now. I mean, it's been refined. And there are new twists that have occurred and new things that make it easier for a customer. So, was there another question? Go ahead.
You hear people making statements like these tubes will last forever because we don't drive them too hard. We operate them conservative. Now, are they talking about play voltage or bias point somewhere?
I would like to thank my cousin Ron over here for asking that question. Look, this is what you got to look at. If you want me to tell you, want to know how to buy a tube product, and I'm not here to sling PrimaLuna, I'm not here to sling anything. You want me to tell you how? Two things. Get something and this is just my opinion, if you get something that is manual bias, that's going to be a little better, because if it's not manual bias, it's cathode bias. And cathode bias amps, where you don't have to bias the tubes, are going to run the tubes harder typically. The other thing you want to look at, it's very simple, WPT. WPT, what do you think that stands for? Watts per tube. It's easy. Does anybody here know how to get 100 watts out of a pair of KT120s? Anybody know? Beat the shit out of them. That's how you get 100 watts out of a pair of KT120s. And there's no there's no magic to it. There's nothing new. There's no secret trick that people use to get more power out of a tube. If you get more power out of a tube, you're biasing it harder. You're running the plate and screen voltage higher. There's no getting around it. It is simple, simple math. Tube equipment should not be difficult to own. It should be something that you can turn on every day like your coffee maker. I wake up every day at 5:20 in the morning and I turn on Led Zeppelin or Nirvana or something, and I'm telling you, and I don't have to worry about it because I've got products that run tubes conservatively. So as an example, the PrimaLuna amplifier with KT120s is going to give you 21 watts out of a KT120. Other brands might give you 40 watts or 50 watts. And they'll say, this is what they'll say. I love this. Well, we're running it within its maximum specification. That's a great thing to say. I got a Mercedes AMG. It is redlined at 6,500 RPM. If I have that car idling at 5,000 RPM, what do you think is going to happen? Is it good for the car or is it not? It's not, of course not. It's crazy. So that's really the easy way you look at it. When you look at an amplifier, you look at the number of devices, the number of power tubes. In an EL34, we give you about 18 watts. KT88, we give you 20 watts. KT120, we give you 21 watts per tube. And so people go, yeah, but I need more power. But they don't really need more power. We want to build this where everybody can take it home and not stress about stuff. This whole thing about tubes being a pain in the ass is such bullshit. They're not a pain in the ass. They're a joy to own. It is so much fun. Go ahead.
So other than plate dissipation, what about playing with lower filament voltage? Your transconductance starts dropping off.
Right.
But is there a magic spot that you find where you can still get 95% of transconductance, but maybe extend the life with 6.2 or 6.1?
Well, I don't know of anybody that's really doing that with filament voltage that I can think of. Maybe. Well, I know, but just for the sake of this discussion here, so we don't go woohoo to propeller head, reality is most everybody who gets more power out of a tube gets it by running the tubes harder. That's just the way that it is. There's no getting around that.
One thing regarding the, okay, say EL34, Dynaco ST70, Marantz 8B, and plenty of other amps were rated, say, 35 or so watts, that 18 or whatever you mentioned per tube. Say 35 watts. Now, another company has had those tubes, and they claim, oh, we have a 70-watt amp, okay, or 80 or 90, whatever, with those same number of tubes.
Per channel.
Now, surprise, what happened is that that particular model, it seemed it could have had a timer in it. In 3 months, the tubes go bad and or the unit wouldn't bias, and in a few years, the unit would go back to the factory. Okay, not fun, but that's what can happen when just pushing things too hard. Per your question earlier when you asked with the older units, okay, some of this is sound quality. I'm sure some of this, whether it's a Marantz, Macintosh, etc., a lot of it is nostalgia, collectability, etc. And, okay, beyond loving tubes, I love and work with old cars, but just example. Say a 53, 54 Corvette. Even when it was new, people didn't like it. It had a 6-cylinder truck engine, barely 100 horsepower net, that weighed, about twice as much as a modern V8. Oh yes, and it had a 2-speed power glide automatic, and should I say it was slow? Oh yeah, it leaked water, it didn't have real windows, okay? But if you have one of those today, it's worth twice as much or 3 times as much as any new Corvette. And by the way, if you start changing that old Corvette, the value will plummet, which is why, and people often ask, well, what about updating or changing these? And all I can think of, just please don't, okay? They're fine as they are. And example, I could think of somebody, and he may or may not be in the show, but at one point he said he wanted a late 50s Lincoln, but All he has to do is change the engine and the transmission and the brakes and the suspension. And it's like, wait, why not start with something that is what you want instead of beyond wasting a lot of money rebuilding it, you'll end up with something that's worth nowhere near what you've paid to change it. Okay, it's just, sorry, I don't make the rules, but that's just what happens. Okay, and generally, people want the older unit stock. You know, they don't want you to make a 2014 Marantz Model C. They want the 1967 unit.
We have one question here. Go ahead. Oh, wait, there's two questions. You go first, because you had your hand up. Hang on.
So I'm kind of new to tube equipment, but the thing that's kind of more disorienting to me is in terms of choices is the tubes themselves, and I was wondering if you could speak to arguments over tubes having a certain sound quality, different manufacturers, and the relative merits of vintage and old stock tubes, which can be very expensive, over modern tubes. And
I sell more new old stock tubes than anybody in. Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it's real simple. In power tubes, EL34 is a little warmer on top, a little fatter in the mid-bass. KT88s, KT120s are kind of similar to each other, more extension on top, a little deeper in the bass, but not quite as fat. I mean, that's my experience and my opinion. As far as vintage tubes go, you're not going to do too much with vintage EL34s because it's cost prohibitive and no one wants. I just don't think you're going to go there. There's tons of vintage stuff, and that's part of the joy of this. It is an absolute hoot. If you buy a $20,000, $40,000 Boulder solid-state system, and you get it home, and you go, the top end's not just quite right, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Get new cables? Go spend 10 grand on cables? If you bought this amplifier, you could change just two 12AU7s at a cost of $100 to get something cool and vintage, and completely change the color of your system to something that really makes your heart sing. That's the beauty of tube stuff. And the guys that have owned it before, was anybody ever rolled tubes before? Anybody ever changed? Is it fun or is it?
It's a blast.
It's a blast.
Yeah.
It is so cool. And it allows you to give your system a gentle nudge in the direction you want to go.
Like
Yeah, an obsession.
sickness.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one thing. You just mentioned something, Kevin, about wires. If you walk up and see some of the manufacturers of cable, you can get something that's $3 a foot or $900 a foot. What's fun with tube amplifiers, especially with tube, because they're such dynamic in their power curves, as well as their performance is over such a larger frequency response. It's interesting to play around, not only changing tubes with certain pieces of music that you like, but also to take a look and not spend a lot of money, but work with some silver and copper wire combinations. You'll see that alone also changes the sound of what you get on your speakers. And you don't have to spend a lot of money out there. There are a lot of now silver wire with copper strands and what are available out there that also can give you a nice enjoyment again of your audiophile and listening experience.
Speaking of speakers, quickly, one of the more important things with tube equipment is matching speakers with amplifiers. That is, you have amplifiers solid state, and it's funny, people say, oh, it's only 200 or it's only 400 watts, okay? You generally don't have that with tubes. However, almost any speaker that's 90 plus dB can work fine, 90 plus dB in efficiency. Now, there was a time when most any classic movie theater, and for that matter, live acts, music would have, let's have JBL-15s, horns, mid-ranges, whatever, and that would be used with tubes for many, many years for any or every movie theater and any or every concert hall through probably mid-60s or later, and it worked fine with tube amps. However, here, for example, these are Focal. This happens to be a 926, and it's interesting because if you look in the current stereo file, it's being given out at this show, November 2014. A cousin of this, the 936, it looks almost the same, was tested, and, quote, the go-to amplifier to be used with that was PrimaLuna integrated amp, okay? So here's a PrimaLuna integrated amp, 35 watts per channel, being used with a modern speaker, but the efficiency of these speakers is rated about 92 or so dB. That's great. If you have a speaker in the mid-80s, not as great, but that 92 dB works fine. And for that matter, we have, here's a PrimaLuna, and there's DACs products that can be 50 watts, 70 watts, or more per channel. And 70 watts in tubes gets you a lot of power, a lot of sound.
Can I say something about that real quick? If you have a moderate-sized room or a medium-sized room, and if you play your music at moderate levels, you'll be just fine with an 88 dB efficient speaker. Bob Deutsch, when he reviewed the Prologue Premium Integrated in Stereophile, he used it with Martin Logan's. He used it with his Golden Ear Triton 2s, which everybody who owns Golden Ears buys that amp, buys the Prologue Premium. If you have a speaker that's 88 dB efficient, unless you are the former lead guitarist of Guns N' Roses, then maybe not. But for most people, I think an 88 dB efficient speaker will run beautifully with 35 watts. Not a problem. Wait a minute. This guy really, hang on 1 second, Ron. This guy.
I agree with what you said about pushing the plate voltage at the expense of reliability of the tubes. But isn't there a trade-off with pushing into Class A, pushing more current through your tubes? My favorite tubes are generally single-ended triodes, or directly heated triodes running way into Class A. So if you're not running very much current and your tubes last a long time, aren't you going to be pretty far into AB?
But what's the question? I don't understand. In a push-pull amp, which these are all push-pull, single-ended is a different thing, and I don't know that it applies. I mean, there is no doubt that a push-pull amp, and 90% of the stuff out there is push-pull. 90% of the customers are push-pull, if not more. If they're getting more power out of a push-pull amp that's running in ultralinear, and most of them are ultralinear, they're doing it by running plate and screen voltage higher and biasing the tubes harder. That's just the way it is. I don't know of any company who says, oh yeah, but we do it different. The other thing I want to say is, remember I talked about having a manual bias being better? There is, and this is the only time I'll pitch about PrimaLuna. PrimaLuna has adaptive auto bias, which is a very sophisticated, fully developed circuit that, to my knowledge, we were the first to come to market with it. It was engineered by Marcel Croza. Marcel Croza was the chief engineer at Goldman in Switzerland. Has anybody ever heard of Goldman? Okay. Goldman components cost what, 50 grand? He designed their most iconic products, and he designed the adaptive auto bias board. I can take this amplifier and I can run a single EL34, a single KT88, a single KT120, and a single KT150 at the same time, and it'll work beautifully. And we've done it at the Consumer Electronics Show and the Newport Show. People just, they don't believe it, but it's true.
Yeah, well, I'd like to also interrupt where DACs has also adaptive bias in our new product line as well. So there are products out there, and that goes back again, whether you go with your screwdriver or you want to experiment with tubes and change tubes. And by the way, we're the experts in SET, in single-ended triode technology, more than the push-pulls. So we're kind of in the 10% of the market, which has that following where, unfortunately, this hotel is backwards. We're talking about old stuff. Unfortunately, I don't have an old laptop here. I have an HDMI port, so I can't show you circuit diagrams and differences that I have here between push-pull amplifier and what SETs do. What are the, the variances and, the frequency responses, and it's up to you, the audiophile, to decide what you like in the sound first. I wouldn't just buy the technology, I'd buy the sound, and each of these technologies, whether they be push-pull or single-ended triode, they attenuate or, not attenuate, but amplify certain different frequencies. Just like guitar amplifiers that are still used today, they're SETs, because the sweet spot is that middle frequency range, the vocals and whatever that you'd like to get out of it. And those, if you want the PowerPoint presentation on some of those variances, just leave your name, email address, and we'll email it over to you. But again, tubes, I'm a tube guy, old Heathkit guy, the old stuff when I was 6 years old. Tubes really, if you go around anywhere, just as taking a look at some of the audio studios upstairs using LP versus digital, you can tell right away, boy, I love tube and I love the sound of LP over transistorized and network-driven DACs and whatever.
So my question, maybe I didn't phrase it. I just worry that if you're focusing only on longevity of tubes, you're going to end up biasing your tubes. I don't care about power output, which is plate voltage. I care about the Class A versus Class AB.
In a push-pull?
I want the tubes to run pretty hot. I want the nice.
Well, I don't know, because you want to, well, I don't want to get this where it bores people, but you want to get to a point where there's no crossover distortion. Once you pass that point, and the tube is linear, and you don't have crossover distortion and a push-pull amp, then you've achieved what you want. The reason for running tubes harder, I cannot see a real reason for it personally. And by the way, I want to just say something. Barrett, they have an adaptive auto bias circuit, which I didn't know that. That's great. VAC has it. I think that Aeon has some type, but I haven't heard anything about it. PrimaLuna has it. If somebody says they have it, they should show you a picture of it and tell you what it is. That's the one thing I want to say. I see reviews in magazines where they say, this amp is auto bias, and it's not. It's cathode bias, and it's a naughty little lie. Cathode bias works great because you don't have to adjust, but it's not good for you in the long term, in my opinion. Go ahead.
Why do people freeze things?
Why do people freeze things? We offer cryogenic treating in the tubes I sell. I tell people I don't know if it really, people who buy it, rebuy it that way. I don't know that it extends life. I don't see how it could. People say it does sound better, and I just have to leave that to the customer.
By the way, with speaker efficiency, are we on? Speaker efficiency, are we on? Here. Is there another one? Okay. Thank you.
No, we're on. We're live. We're hot.
Sorry. Anyway, so just some little math. First, it's much, much easier to get volume you need from efficient speakers than just dumping more power into an inefficient speaker. Okay? Just little math. Say these are about 93. Say they're 93 dB. And say we have a 40 watt amp. Okay? Okay, that's 109 dB from one speaker, 112 dB from two speakers with 40 watts. And by the way, it's just math, okay? 112 dB, two speakers with a 40 watt amp, which is fairly easy to get from tubes. Now, say we have, and there's plenty of them out there and plenty in the show, say we have an 83 dB speaker efficiency. Okay, you'll think, gee, now all we need is 400 watts? Well, first, once you let the smoke out of the speaker, it stops. Okay, almost no speakers can handle that kind of power. Beyond which, especially with speakers other than massive 4-inch voice coils, with most small speakers, there's a certain point where the speaker just stops getting louder. Okay, where you have a 1-inch voice coil, it's gotten really hot, a 4-ohm speaker becomes an 8 or 16-ohm speaker. An 8-ohm speaker becomes a 16 or 32-ohm speaker. There's a certain point, it's called dynamic compression, where the speaker just stops getting louder, okay? And when you're running, say, 40 watts into efficient speakers, that's just not a problem. You try to run hundreds of watts into inefficient speakers, the dynamic range just is not there. That's what happens. Charles? Oh, by the way, Charles has the Darrad products. There's several very affordable $500 or so amplifiers that are hybrids. And this is a great way to get into tubes, where you have, beyond being a hybrid and being small and affordable, they have digital inputs or have DACs built in. And it's a great way to start into tubes.
Testing. There. That's one of the things that when you go around to any of the audio shows, I sometimes say audiophiles are a dying breed. Not everyone comes out and say I'll be able to afford $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, let alone a $50,000 or $500,000 amplifier, as you see upstairs in some of the suites. Most of the newer generation are all out there for I call self-immediate gratification. I got a music player, or I got especially my smartphone, and I'm listening to music, listening to internet, and so on. One of the things that, as a manufacturer, we see trends where we certainly have new products that are coming out, but like Ron said, there are less and less CD players being sold, more and more LP. Phonographs being sold, more phonograph preamplifiers being sold. So you'll see some trends that we vision where we want to make a crossroad where we can use perhaps an AB MOS output for your amplification, but your preamplifier is using a 6N2 tube. So you're getting the great response and the frequency response and the dynamism out of the preamp, and where some of these mono blocks that are there that make, by the way, amplifiers very affordable for college students and such to get into audio, where we follow the tube one-to-one. So we're kind of rewriting the way that we're making amplifiers or integrated amplifiers, where we're bringing in the preamplification stage to be the key, and then afterwards we use a linear amplifier on the output. And those devices, by the way, are great for us tube lovers like me with my Mac 2550 and some of my old Dynaco PA5 preamplifier, where I'd like to add maybe a USB DAC, or I'd like to put Bluetooth. So these little devices that are like $500 can now upgrade my older system and still maintain the integrity of me loving tubes.
By the way, adding to that, there are hybrid amplifiers out there, usually integrated, but one of the more popular ways people have done, say somebody starts with a tube preamp and they want more power, well, use whatever solid state power amp. It's possible to get the greater warmth, better imaging soundstage from the tubes, and at the same time have some more power. Or people will take, say, oh gee, this CD player sounds harsh, brittle, whatever. You mean it's not perfect sound forever? That's what Sony claimed. Anyway, and lots of their dealers. So that digital-itis sound sometimes can be tamed by taking, say, a tube preamp, a tube power amp, and suddenly things sound much warmer. Suddenly things just sound far better. And it makes a lot bigger difference, say, than cables or, some other things that some people try. So
yeah, and I'd just like to add something that's maybe completely off skew, where I hate. I'm an LP guy. I love LPs. There's no way with digital technology where you're going to still at this time take what we have from the analog world, because we do record all in analog, and then add this thing called digital signal processing, where we're only sampling a portion. So you have a great turntable, you have a great cartridge, you're getting great frequency response, and then all of a sudden you're putting it into some device that's now sampling at whatever sample rate, and we're not getting the full complement of the music. I just, I walk by some of the salons here, either at this show, the Taiwan show, whatever, and I've seen where people are using all this great DAC stuff with, online streaming, and it sounds horrible, and some of this stuff is $500,000 worth. And you can see systems for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 that are tube, that are with reasonable speakers, and an LP player that's a TD150 from Thorens with a nice Ortofon cartridge, outperforming something that costs more than my house times 2. So and now they're talking again where again, CD was the convenience that started the problem, because we wanted Walkman with portable music, and the car manufacturers drove the CD taking the little 64-bit or 24-bit sampling and putting it in a car environment. And the convenience went to convenience rather than the quality of the LP. And that's why, especially traveling around the world, as Kevin does as well, Asia and Europe are all LP crazy. I go and buy LPs there that are latest pressings that complement my system. I even buy SACDs for my SACD player that's sitting there for the last 6-7 years, all back again, because the Asians and the Europeans are into music. So couple that with the great tube technology that we have, because we were really the pioneers of tube, Americans. And boy, we got a great hobby, and we got a great enjoyment for pleasure. And I wanted to put that little 2 bits in there because I think this is a renaissance. And from an industry standpoint, from Kevin, from Ron, who's been in the business since the early ages of himself building things and blowing things up, which we all have done, the renaissance is there, and I encourage everyone to get the younger generation to stream some of their music into some tube equipment, and they'll get the bite as well.
I remember once electrical engineer came in, and his mission, like search for the Holy Grail, he had to find a solid state amp to sound as good as a tube amp, but not within double the price of the tube. Say if a tube amp he loved was 1,000, he was searching for some sort of solid state that would sound as good at 2,000. I'm not sure he ever found it. Okay, but another thing, just remembering, somebody brings in a 1960-something Fisher, probably original tubes. Okay, and we put it in, we listened to it. Right behind them, somebody brought in, let me just say, a modern 7 or whatever channel receiver from a name with 5 letters that you would well recognize, that a lot have been sold in this city or throughout the United States. Okay, and the person who brings in the modern receiver is taken aback and says, why that old thing sounds better than my receiver. You smile and say, yep. Okay, and that new receiver was 1,000, or was actually far, far more money than, say, any used Fisher amp sells for today. And it's interesting because this was last month. There was CEDIA, Custom Electronic Design Industry Association, which is largely surround sound, AV, etc. And there were the latest 11-channel plus 2 subwoofer receivers, and without saying anything, people came up to me and said, well, I guess you didn't like this, or gee, I guess this doesn't measure up to tubes. And I didn't say anything, but at the same time also there seems, and this was very much in CEDIA, it's like, okay, now how can we have sound going through every room of the house and still keep it mediocre? But we have to have it going throughout the whole house.
Yeah, the question here before, or someone had, if this is from the Electronics Industry Manufacturing Association's, black box, if you want, their skunk works. And I can share this, but I'm not going to read it. But so tuber transistor was one of the slides I had. So here we have about vacuum tubes advantages, about 12 advantages. And this comes not from, anyone selling. This comes from the engineers and from the council and from all these guys that are rocket scientists. So there's a dozen advantages for vacuum tubes. If we go into, whoops, there we go back here, sorry. If we go into vacuum tubes disadvantages, there are about 8. So I'm going to continue the process. Transistors advantages, maybe about 6 or 8. And then disadvantages of transistor, 2 pages worth. So just something interesting for all us old farts that love tube, and where really, once you've heard a tube, you'll never go back to solid state. Not even for $500,000, I'm sorry to say.
You have
that.
a question
There's
there?
some people that have it.
You mentioned, Kevin, the virtues of point-to-point wiring in tube amplifiers. And my buddy has a pair of Quicksilvers from made in the 1980s. He's never had anything go wrong with them. And I have a music reference, and his amps are 10 years older, I've already had to have mine serviced because the parts go out. I wonder why more tube manufacturers don't do point-to-point wiring.
Because it's too expensive.
Money.
Because it's too expensive. I mean, everybody would prefer to have that. In my opinion, I think you would, but it's too expensive. The only people that do really good point-to-point wiring that I've seen, I mean, really nice handiwork in the U.S. is going to be like Atmosphere. I mean, they make a nice product inside.
Yeah, I'd like to
It's
maybe
expensive.
comment. I'd like to maybe comment on point-to-point. Point-to-point obviously is the best, especially using, you know, either oxygen-free copper wire or even silver, and everything has a nuance. But the technologies exist also, very expensive, to have multi-layered, very heavy copper PCBs. PCB industry's changed. SMT has changed everything. Where now we have 5 or 8 layers of circuitry in a PCB board, and my other part of the company works for military projects for GPS. We now go backwards in time to very heavy copper layered back to RF decks, which are now appearing in tube amplifiers of significant value. $100,000 and $200,000 tube amplifiers with heavy copper and going away for the point-to-point, not for, how should we say it, cost, because the copper in very, very heavy, what they call it, 0.2, is more expensive than having someone wire point-to-point. It's bringing different characteristics into those manufacturers' designs. So I basically boil down to whether you go to Ron's store and buy something that's 40 years old, or you buy something that's $500,000 upstairs, it's your ears. You like it, you buy it. And there's such variety, and that's what I think is good with the renaissance of tubes, because, you know, there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's nice to get back. It's easy to service. That's one of the things that, you know, the electronics industry manufacturers engineering group says. It's very easy to repair because point-to-point wiring, you can understand it, and so on. So, but at the same time, there's also a following for the better transistorized equipment. And I'd like to, for the people that are on the transistor side of the audience, to say everything goes down to the power supply and, again, the transformers. The output transformers are key. Everyone said, oh, very good. That's why some of Ron's store, and I love his store, one amplifier made 30 years ago is 150 pounds, huge. Our typical ones that have it's all transformer. And then the ones that came out later that were saying they were better and greater, I'll use Harman Kardon as one of the names, you know, because they've gone away from their true bringing up and tutelage, where they're light. Wow, there's nothing in it. So heavy is good. That's also a good indicator, irrespective of tube or transistor.
Yeah, actually,
there's something to be said about it. You can almost buy stereo equipment by the pound, to some degree.
yeah.
I mean, if it doesn't have much in it.
And by the way, it's interesting because there was a time, there was a Carver Cube. Adcom had a similar model, whereas, you know, gee, let's have a supposed 400-watt amp that weighs 8 pounds or whatever. Almost never do those things still work, okay? Plenty of 50-pound Crown, Macintosh, et ceteras that are solid state and older than that are working. But yeah, somehow you put more materials in, it can help. By the way, when solid state first came out, because it was a new technology, it was much more expensive than tubes. But then there became a certain point with, gee, solid state requires one transformer, a tube unit, at least 3. You have 2 output transformers, and you have a power transformer, and you have, say, 300-400 whatever volts going to tubes. 70 volts is a lot to go to transistors. You know, it's harder, more expensive. It takes more materials. It takes more steel, copper, whatever. There are reasons why tube things cost more. But as far as point-to-point goes, it's interesting because we've seen modern receivers where more often than it should happen, circuit boards will go bad, or, oh, here's a burn trace. Now let's solder a wire across that trace to try to fix it. Not fun. Now, a circuit board has microscopically thin layer of copper or whatever atoms on there. Somehow, if you have 16 gauge or 18 gauge wire point to point, it's not just that it's more reliable, it sounds better. You just have more current that could be transferred through that piece of wire than the microscopically thin printed circuit layer.
I would suggest to you, if you're going to be buying a piece of equipment, that you maybe take a peek under the hood. That's what I would do. I would type in what you're considering into Google, and then click on images, and you'll find pictures somewhere by somebody where they took a picture of one upside down with its underpants showing, and that's the way to show it, with its underpants showing. That's why we make such a big deal about looking at how things are done at PrimaLuna. This wiring in this amp is imported from Switzerland. Silver-plated continuous crystal oxygen-free copper with a Teflon dielectric. The resistors, the pink ones in the signal path, are high-end resistors called TACMAN from Japan. I mean, it's big shit, and you look, it's your money. I mean, you should get something that you're proud of, that captures your heart, and it's built to last a lifetime. And I'm going to tell you one thing right now. I would rather have a tube integrated amp that costs $2,399 over a $30,000 solid state system. I swear that to you. Albert von Schweikert bought our little cheapest amp for $17.95, and he called me. It was after hours, and he said, "Kevin, I'm laying here listening to music with my wife, and both of us agree we prefer the sound of your little amplifier on our little bookshelf speakers over our big statement system." And a big statement system at von Schweikert's big stuff. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is something that captures your heart. Was there any other questions that people had, though? Uh-oh, here we go.
So, sounded earlier like your 2-3L34, GT, 8120. What do you think the differences are between those, the higher power tubes like the 211 or 845?
Well, a 211 or an 845 is a different animal altogether, and sometimes they're going to be, most of the time they're going to be run single-ended. And I own that stuff. So when I was talking about SET stuff and Class A, I'm not against that. I own some of it in my collection. For me, if I was going to have one thing, I don't think it would be single-ended for me. I think it's tremendous fun, and there's always people that want to go to that because it's different, and there is a vibrancy to single-ended components. There's a coloration that occurs. Look at, there's nothing, when I hear about people say this all the time in magazines, minimal coloration. What is wrong with color? I don't get that. I mean, I prefer music that has a little color. I don't want .005 THD. I don't want a bunch of negative feedback. There's nothing to making this amplifier measure like a solid state amp. Look at Sonic Frontiers. Anybody here remember those guys? They made great amplifiers that captured the imagination of a lot of people. Then they came out with their second series, the Power 1, 2, and 3. What did they do? They made a measure with a damping factor of 50, low output impedance. They made a measure, and they made them sound like a solid state amp. So what did the reviews say? It's a great sounding amp, it doesn't do anything wrong, but there's kind of something missing. That's what all the magazines said, and 2 years later, Sonic Frontiers was history as a company.
Yeah, I'd like to, we've done something different at Darrett. We're not looking for power. Again, going on the SET side, we're now introduced the KD 150 tube instead of the 120. Same power output, same electronic circuitry, basically, but just listen to the difference in the tube. And again, it goes back to power isn't everything, and it's the way that we take care of the bandwidth and the power bandwidth. One of the things that I did want to say, when you come home with any equipment, what does your wife say? Does she? How many people have a significant other here that says, I can't tell the difference between what this and that? Okay. Well, I have the same thing. Every couple of years I go and buy new equipment and whatever. And my wife said, I remember once upon a time we made a lot of money, so I got Steve Carver's Super Duper, the Golden Cinema, whatever, 200 watt per channel times 7 home theater system. $40,000 at the time. And, you know, had some nice Infinity speakers, some JBL studio monitors. I worked it up. And my wife says, "Can you hear the difference?" Yeah, I can hear the difference. Well, now I've replaced all that with just a nice little SET amplifier, 7 of them, running 20 watts with a KD120. And my wife comes in and she says, "I can hear the difference. This is great." For 32 years, she said, "You don't hear anything. It's you and your pocketbook and more expensive works." So I'm going back to all you guys that have a significant, you'll definitely be able to get her on your side if you're buying tube stuff, not the solid state stuff.
Well, speaking of specs, there was a time, and just Kenwood, for example, had, oh no, our amps don't have hundreds of thousands. We have thousands of, 0.000 whatever percent distortion. Okay, fine. But I remember someone who, he had built an ICO ST70, Brooklyn, New York, and where they were originally from. And this ICO ST70 35 watt per channel integrated amp from the 60s, replaced it with a Kenwood, and this Kenwood is horrible, okay? Yes, the Kenwood had better specs, but it didn't sound good. And you wonder, did any of the engineers listen to this thing? You know, to me, how it sounds, I think, matters a lot more than, gee, what are the specs?
I agree, and your wife will tell the difference with tube, boy, I'll tell you. She now says, she has a hard time with me when I say over the phone what I've seen at the solid state side for $500,000, and she says, "Don't you ever dare come in this house with anything that's solid state at $500,000.
Well, also speaking of value, okay, so we had a system set up with, let me just say, a nice tube amp, similar to these things, okay, a nice tube amp, and there actually were some speakers, actually it was an older version of these, and so someone comes in from another store and is listening. There's somebody working at another high-end place, and saying, so how much is this system? And I thought, maybe under 3,000 to 4,000. And he said, no, you don't understand the question. I said, how much, how much does the whole system cost, not just the speakers. And I said, yeah, well, this is 1,000, this is 1,000, this is 1,000, it's about 3,000. Wait, you can't do that for 3,000. Why, it's going to cost 10 grand or more at our store. And I'm thinking, gee, maybe that's why we have this tube amplifier here. This happened within the past year.
Has anybody here heard about the KT150 tube? Anybody hear about it? I'm going to tell you something. I don't get excited about new tubes. Oh, there's a new KT120. It's a good tube. KT120s are fine. They sound like a KT88. There's a new this. I'm going to tell you something, because our products accept them. And I plugged them into my own, and I just didn't expect much. That tube is a revelation. And you talk about the sound of an 845 or a 300B. The KT150 has a vibrancy in the mid-range, and the music just appears like a out of nowhere. It is stunning to me. It is the first time I've ever heard a current production tube where I go, oh my God, this is a big deal. So I don't know what amplifiers are going to be compatible with them. I know which ones are from us. All the current ones are, but all the current PrimaLunas will take them. But I'm going to tell you, if you have an amp now, check to see if you can use them. Buy them, because they are bitchin'.
Yeah, and we have it running upstairs with our amp. It's just amazing, Great development. Ron, what else do we have in the seminar here? I'm your manager here for time.
Kevin, more things you wanted to say?
No. Was there any other questions? Because there's always questions.
Excuse me,
Here.
just quickly, okay. There are people who, several things. First, they'll say, well, is there any difference, and why would somebody want tubes? And let me hear the difference. Then afterwards, somebody hears the difference, and it doesn't become questioning the value of tubes. Sometimes it's, so why is the tube better? Why does tube, okay? And several things. First, you have a solid-state amplifier. The initial distortion can be less. There's a certain point where the amplifier clips, and distortion can go from 0.01 or 0.1 to, 10, 20, 30, 50%, which is just horrible, okay? And by the way, quickly destroys tweeters. Tube amplifiers, when they clip, and the tube amp might start off at a 1/4%, 0.5%, fine. Our ears don't really mind that. Then the tube amp clips, and it becomes, 2%, 3%. And again, our ears don't really mind that. There's something about when the tube amp clips, it does it more gracefully, and it recovers more easily, and just our ears like that better. Something also is just, this is going basic music, when, say we have middle A, 440 on a piano, okay, 440 cycles per second. Now, if a tube adds distortion to that, it will become what's known as a second harmonic. Second harmonic would be like, here's A here, now let's play A an octave above, which would be A880, okay? It's the same note, but just an octave higher. Our ears love that. Now, that's even order harmonics. Solid state, by its nature, does odd order harmonics. So suddenly, instead of 440, we get 1320, or 2020. We get these other frequencies that just don't appear in music, and our ears don't like that. And these different distortion characteristics are one of the major reasons just that tubes sound different. Thank you.
Yes. Question?
Yes. Has anyone begun to think about manufacturing vacuum tubes again in this country?
Yeah, there's a guy who's crazier than a shithouse rat that's trying to do it.
Yeah,
So,
he's in the
making
East Coast, I think, right?
No, he's here actually. He's in he's not here. I'm not in Nevada. Am I? Am I in Nevada? Okay, I'm in Colorado. He's in Nevada.
Oh, yeah.
And
RC.
he's making 6L6 GCs. I just went and I visited a tube factory in Prague. I went to the EAT factory. And I'm just telling you, you've got to be a glutton for punishment for making tubes. So he's making 6L6 GCs. I don't know if he's really selling them right now. One of my dear friends in Europe just bought the tooling from the EI factory. And so he had planned to get some production going. And he's a good friend of mine, and he just asked me if he could borrow a large sum of money because, you know what, it is tough. It's very difficult to do. I can't imagine it. I mean, to make something right, you have to make a lot of them. And that's why the Reflector factory in Russia does it. That's why JJ does it in the Czech Republic, or in Slovakia, rather. You have to be able to make a lot of them. So this guy will struggle, and I swear I hope that he does it.
Yeah.
Thinking, there's such a difference when you get a good, well-made tube in a piece of tube musical electronic equipment, that there should be a viable market for superior quality vacuum tubes.
Yeah, but the tooling's gone. Where is it? I don't know where the old Sylvania tooling went. The old Richardson still makes tubes, but they make big.
Yeah, the big transmitting
The big
tubes.
transmitter tubes.
Yeah.
So Richardson's a real company.
Yeah.
But outside of that, I don't know where the old Sylvania and the old GE. I know the GE stuff did go to Richardson. The 6550 manufacturing equipment went there, and they were making them at Richardson for some years. And but outside of that, I just don't know that you could crank it up again. They're making them in Russia. The stuff's there. They got cheap labor, and I got to tell you, they're doing a pretty good job. So I don't know that I would want to try to do it here. It'd be
Yeah,
crazy money.
one little anecdote on that is I was CEO of a division of General Electric, and I worked with the folks in Owensboro, Kentucky, and they had a big water tank outside. It was a vacuum tube for the city supply. And this is back in 1986, and I visited there. A fellow picked me up at the airport with his little pickup truck with bales of hay in the back. The thing was a 1960s. I didn't know it was a collector's item. I thought I went back 40 years. Anyways, here I am at the factory, 4 floors. Interesting how they burn in all the tubes. They have a rotary, like a cement plant where, you know, they make cement in a big rotary oven. Well, this was a rotary oven with 500 tubes all in a row, all being burned and slowly going around where people would plug them in, and then on the other side, a day later, they'd be unplugging them out. And I remember walking down the floor, and I see all these stretchers here. I said, what the hell we have? I mean, this is a hospital or what? Gurneys. Oh, well, the company's policy is we're not going to hire any more employees. And basically, the employees, the average age was in their 60s, early 60s, and they would literally have a stroke or a heart attack or die on the job. And that's what these gurneys were. So when 911 was called, they were already prepackaged, ready to go. And I said, I'm selling General Electric AM microwaves with big tubes, obviously, and also the cameras with the SIT tubes and whatever, which were all made there. And wow, but to go back to your question, I'll tell you, it was beautiful to see us making tubes in America. I've seen some plants overseas and whatever. Nothing compared to everything. The tooling was all made again by people, 60 years ago. It's just amazing. Vive les lampes!
If you want to see something cool, go to YouTube and type in Mullard Tube Factory. Has anybody seen those videos? I knew it. Somebody would. It's really cool to see how big those factories were. I mean, it's crazy stuff.
Well, and tubes beyond being used here, most every radio transmitter use them, shortwave transmitters use them, test equipment, movie theaters. I mean, there was a time when not just all electronics before 65 or so was run on tubes, but for decades later, you want to do FM broadcasting, you use transmitting tubes. This was the technology that worked.
They're prodding us out. So what do you got, Ron? Anything else bad? Well, guys, tubes rule. And,
Okay, and actually 482, 484, you can see more, you could listen to some of these products
Go
if
check
you
out that KT150 at Derek. That's a badass sounding tube. If anybody wants to look at anything or questions and wants to see the inside guts or something, come up and I'm happy to do so.